Welcome to the Fair District's Fair Democracy Huddle, and we are so blessed. We have the authors of Draw the Line in Ohio. This is going to be a really interesting conversation. Before we get started, I'm going to encourage you all to put your name and where you're from in the chat. This is always more fun when you ask questions. So I'm going to encourage you to put your questions for the authors into the Q&A. And once again, please let us know, who you are and where you're from. And we're just really glad that you're here. And I noticed Canton here. We've got a Grandview Heights. We have Dayton. It's always more fun when we know where folks are from, and we're really glad that you're here. So for many of us, we were haunting the Statehouse during 2020 and 2021, and we were closely following everything that was going on with redistricting. And so I don't know about you, I was a little worried about going back and thinking about all of the things that we went through, because it was incredibly challenging, incredibly hard. One of the things that I really think about, Draw the Line in Ohio, it has to do with the humor it was in this. It just made me feel like, okay, this ability to look back and consider. And so with that, why don't we begin? Okay, so we have a basic agenda. I'm going to say once again, I'm Catherine Terser from Common Cause, Ohio. I just want to welcome you all. We are so blessed because Rory Riley Topping and Josh Rultenberg are here today to talk about their new book. And this is Draw the Line in Ohio, How One State's Fight for Fair Maps Explains Gerrymandering in America. And so if you have a question for the authors, please put it in the Q&A. I'm going to encourage you again, if you hadn't had a chance, put your name and where you're from into the chat. And I thought we could start off with a review. And this review is from Arnold Schwarzenegger. He says, Draw the Line in Ohio provides more proof that politicians will do everything they can to pick their voters instead of letting voters pick them. And my other favorite review was from Dave Wasserman, who you might know from the Cook Political Report. In an era of dizzying cartographic acrobats, when we seemingly have gone from redistricting every 10 years to every 10 seconds, Rory Riley Topping and Josh Rultenberg have performed a true public service by chronicling one state's tug of war between Republican gerrymandering, voters demanding reform, and ever-shifting courts. And so this is going to be a really exciting discussion. And once again, I wanted to welcome you. And so, Rory, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, but people should know that you are a lawyer, you are an on-air commentator on all sorts of legal things, and I've always been really impressed by all the work that you've done surrounding veterans.
Mhm.
And then I'm going to hand it off to you, Rory, to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So, like you said, I'm a lawyer, author, commentator. I've done a lot of work in the veteran space. I used to be the staff director of the House Veterans Affairs Committee in Washington, D.C. My husband is a veteran. We spent about 5 years living in Dayton, which is my time in Ohio. I currently live in New England, which is where I am originally from, but Ohio is still near and dear to my heart. So, um, yeah, that's basically me.
And then Josh, you may remember Josh. Basically, when I said we were haunting the State House, I feel like you were stalking the governor, stalking the legislators, trying to see what was happening as much as possible behind the scenes. There were two different doors to enter, and Josh would move from one door to the next door. And so, we have so much appreciated the work that you did when you were in Ohio for Spectrum News. It really gave us a sense of what was happening, even if we didn't get to the State House. And so, Josh, could you introduce yourself?
You're muted.
Thank you for that. Catherine, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. Fair Districts, thanks for having me, and Rory. And yeah, I mean, look, I spent 2 years in Columbus, Ohio, as the Statehouse reporter for Spectrum News. And wow, what a 2 years between 2020 and 2022. I came in and it was June of 2020 when we were all locked down, and I had to basically convince people in the community and the lawmakers that I was a state house reporter when I wasn't allowed to step foot in the state house, and then finally when I was allowed to, it was 2021, and we had this whole can of worms just open. And you guys did so much work in the years leading up to it, thinking that this was going to be the end all be all and everything was going to be great. And Ohio was going to be the example for the rest of the country about what would go right until it didn't. And yeah, I remember being there every step of the way with you, Catherine, and others that were in this room, in this chat right now. And um, just a little bit about me. For 15 years, I was a journalist around the country with stops in Alabama, New York, Connecticut, lower in New York City, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and then I ended my political reporting career in Washington, D.C., which is where I am right now. Currently, I do work in Congress. I will be there only until the end of this month, when I will be actually leaving my job, to ultimately just see where this book and this space can take us.
Mhm.
And so, sort of betting on myself in this moment, but truly, what happened with this story, as you'll read, as you'll hear from us, when we were experiencing this with Ohio, of course, we were on the ground in Ohio seeing what was happening, but we knew that even though what was happening in Ohio wasn't just what was happening there, it's happening everywhere. And, you're seeing it play out in real time right now. So, I'll let everybody else sort of, ask us questions, and we'll share a few excerpts here. But I mean, look, you could take the kid out of Ohio, but you just can't take the Ohio out of the kid anymore. And like Rory said, Ohio will always be part of me now, for all of the reasons.
Well, I thought I would start with a really obvious question. Why did you decide to write the book?
I was just coming off finishing my first book, which is called Justice and the American Veteran. It's an institutional history of the United States Court of Veterans Claims. So just, I know you referenced my work on veterans issues. And I personally found that I love writing books. One of the downsides of our current media environment is everybody's attention span is really short. So you don't have a lot of time to do really in-depth analysis. And there are a lot of issues out there that I feel deserve a much more in-depth analysis. Coming off of the court history book, I knew I wanted to write another book. And this kind of overlapped with that time period of post-COVID. I had a newborn at the time, so I was up at all weird hours thinking about weird things like what to write books about. Um, and as we got into this, Josh would call on me frequently to help with the analysis of what was going on at the State House. And it became really clear fairly early on in this process that, there were some people who were up to no good. And I felt like I couldn't really put my finger on why, but I knew that something bigger was percolating. And as things started to get more intense and more dramatic, I kept saying to Josh, like, oh my God, this is crazy. Somebody should write a book about this. And then I finally put those two thoughts I was having together. I was like, wait a minute. I want to write another book, and someone should write a book about this. The people to do that should be us. I reached out to Josh and just said, like, I think there's a story here. I think it needs to be told. Like, what do you think? Are you in? Just because his firsthand perspective of being in the State House, witnessing all of the events in person, I just thought would be such a valuable perspective that would make telling this story so much better than from people who weren't in the room and maybe couldn't describe the atmosphere and the tension and how thick it was during some of these moments.
And I would say that Rory really was the driving force behind this. I mean, everything she said is 100% true. I have spent my career talking about things on television. I didn't spend my career writing books. So any writing that I did was television writing. And Rory basically in the beginning, she knew that of course I was there and that I knew all of the players, both in the government and the advocacy space. And she basically said, look, if you can help get us the interviews, I'll do a lot of the heavy lifting. And really, Rory led this effort. And I contributed obviously with the reporting. The one thing that I'll definitely say about this book is, as we were trying to figure out what exactly to write about, sure, we were going to write about the reporting that I was doing and what played out, but we knew that that was likely only to get the politically involved person. So the question was, is how do we expand that? Because really, we want to talk to not just the politically involved person, but the non-politically involved, right? Because there's so many that just aren't. And so, as you'll see, and for those that will ultimately end up ordering and reading this book, we use a lot of pop culture references throughout this book to basically say, if you care about a sports cheating scandal, or if you care about a celebrity cheating scandal, you should care about this because it's exactly the same thing and it weighs a lot more. And so, I don't want to give too much away, but that's why you have to order the book. But I'm really glad that Rory convinced me to do this. I look at this as, one of, if not the biggest achievements of my life. And obviously, I'm really excited for, everybody to read it. Looking forward to all the feedback,
I'm a lawyer,
whatever
so
comes.
I'm very convincing.
Fair.
Well, just, as a little bit of a teaser, I was hoping that one of you would read an excerpt from the book.
Yeah, so we pulled two excerpts from the book, and I don't know if you want us to do both, or we can do one now, one a little
Let,
bit later.
let's do one now and one a little later.
Okay.
So I think the
Very
one
good.
that we'll do first, because the excerpts that we pulled, one is from the book's introduction and one is from the book's epilogue. And we specifically pulled these portions in part because, Catherine, in conversations we had with you, with everything that was going on this summer, it was like, gosh, people are feeling a little depressed.
Yep.
Is there anything we can feel hopeful about? So the passages that we selected are with that perspective in mind. So with that, I will read the one from the introduction, and then Josh will read the one from the epilogue when the time comes. So here we go. Talking about gerrymandering is a great way to flip the script. It has all the elements of the classic feel-good narrative. One side becomes the self-styled evil empire, twisting the game to stay in power, while the other emerges as the lovable underdog, fighting for fairness, like Star Wars for state legislatures. This brings us to Ohio. The state's post-2020 redistricting drama rivals any reality TV show. Think Vanderpump Rules, dramatic, disorderly, and full of petty people pretending that they don't have ulterior motives. Principles over politics, people proclaim with increasing fervor as they decry the erosion of our political norms. If that ideal should prevail anywhere, it should be in Ohio. This isn't just America's heartland, it's where Midwest nice prevails. It's the birthplace of both rock and roll and the airplane. It's so quintessentially Americana that it is often referred to as both a battleground and a bellwether because it correctly predicted the winner of the presidency from 1960 to 2016. As author David Giffels put it in the book Barnstorming Ohio, the state is a reflection of the nation, a conscience of sorts, even in a time when that reflection felt more like one from a funhouse mirror. What happens in Ohio doesn't stay in Ohio. We'll continue reserving that for Vegas. But there's a reason the state is the test market for everything from food companies to democracy itself. Its capital city, Columbus, is referred to as Test City, USA, because Ohio's demographics so closely mirror the rest of the United States. If a pizza topping or a policy works here, it'll work anywhere. For example, the first heartbeat bill, which outlawed abortion once a fetal heartbeat was detected, usually around 6 weeks of pregnancy, was introduced in Ohio before other states followed. In 2023, two ballot initiatives, each known as Issue 1, put Ohio back in the national spotlight as a predictor of nationwide political trends. National abortion opponents used Ohio as a test market, declared Cleveland.com. An Ohio amendment serves as a testing ground for statewide abortion fights expected in 2024, read a headline from the Associated Press. Former Ohio Democratic Party Chair Liz Walters put it best. We are the experiment lab for the entire country. States like Florida, Arizona, and Texas have taken their cues from bills that restrict voting access here in Ohio. This brings us back to gerrymandering and why the story of Ohio's recent redistricting battle is one of national importance. Ohio is ground zero for gerrymandering, Christian Gross, a political science professor at the University of Southern California's Schwarzenegger Institute, told us. If you can get away with rigging districts there, you can get away with it anywhere. And gerrymandering anywhere is a threat to democracy everywhere. We should be just as outraged about it as we are about cheating football teams. The good news is, Ohio's test market has revealed that voters have tools to fight back. 26 states, including Ohio, have a statewide ballot initiative or referendum process, a direct line for citizens to override their lawmakers. Rather than disengaging from the political process because participation seems futile, direct democracy can still beat the political machine with time, grit, and a lot of signatures. As Honest Abe himself declared, our government is supposed to be of the people, by the people, for the people, not of the party, by the party, for the party. Also, it should go without saying, but the moral of Ohio's redistricting drama isn't that Republicans are bad. In a hyper-partisan age, that is an easy, albeit lazy, takeaway. This book emphasizes why partisan gerrymandering is problematic and why civic engagement is important. It's not about one political party over another. Democrats also gerrymander when given the chance, as demonstrated in California, New York, Illinois, Virginia, and Maryland, to name a few. This book isn't about those states because we did not have the same front row seats to their redistricting battles as we did in Ohio. But we are just as outraged at what happened in those states as we are about what happened in the heartland. The focus on Republicans' wrongdoing in this book is simply a product of circumstance. Those in power do whatever they can to keep it. In Ohio, Republicans controlled the Ohio Redistricting Commission, so they were the ones getting caught with their hands in the proverbial cookie jar here. Republicans also declined our interview requests at a much higher rate than their Democratic colleagues did. Instead, they directed us to their online newsroom, a blog and podcast combo on an official government website titled On the Record, which claims it promotes Republican views that the Ohio media won't publish. One of those views is that gerrymandering is the mainstream media's big lie. The Ohio Capital Journal fired back, referring to their platform as alternative facts that bear little relation to life on Earth. It's a really strategic way to make something appear to be neutral information and fact when that's not reality. Laura Manley, executive director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, told the Associated Press. I've never seen anything like that. It's really smart in a really devious way. Being really smart in a really devious way is a theme we return to often throughout this book. Republicans in Ohio have perfected the art, and states like Texas and California have followed their lead. Finding a way to bend the rules if you can't win on the merits is a tale as old as time. But so is not losing hope, which is exactly what those who are lying and cheating their way to power want you to do. The most powerful person in any state isn't one of its elected leaders. It's an engaged, informed citizen who refuses to look away. In a February 2024 CNN broadcast, anchor John Berman and data analyst Harry Enton referred to New York's redistricting battle as our Star Wars. If you care about saving democracy, then redistricting should be your Star Wars too, no matter where you live and how you vote. You shouldn't be rooting for Darth Vader. May the force of fair maps be with you. We take you through what happens when they aren't and what you can do to change that.
May the force of fair maps be with you. I love that.
Thanks.
Oh, well, would it be okay if I ask you a few questions?
Sure.
Okay. So one of the things that I think is interesting is that the two of you approach the project from different professional perspectives, so law and journalism. And so, how did you combine those perspectives and do you think it actually helped strengthen the narrative and tell us a little dirt about what kind of challenges you had as you were writing?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that, I was just literally texting Rory right before we did this, saying that, I think we should really lean into our two different lanes here. This story was told because of the fact, obviously, that I was reporting on the situation. But, while you guys and everybody in this chat are really politically inclined, not everybody knows what gerrymandering is. It's a wonky word. It should be gerrymandering. That's a whole other story. But nobody knows what gerrymandering is. What is that? And so as you learn about it, and you realize it's not about maps, it's about who has power and what they do with it. Ultimately, yes, it came from the journalism, but as I was trying to describe this every single day on TV, I knew that there was a lot of legalese. And it's like, what are these words? What is Section 6? What are you talking about? If I can't understand it, how is the average person going to understand it? And so we had Rory, who was our legal expert at the time. We talked for months on end, and we knew that this had to be explained in both ways. We had to explain what exactly the law was saying, what it was supposed to say, what the lawmakers weren't doing when it came to the law, and then ultimately with the journalism angle, what that meant. Where was the repercussions? Where's the accountability or lack thereof?
Yeah, so I would add when I was a legal analyst for Spectrum News One Ohio, and people would ask what I did, I would say I take really legally dense information and make it accessible to a wider audience. And so, as Josh pointed out, lawyers use lots of fancy words, they use too many words. You mentioned some of the challenges. That was a challenge that Josh and I had because I'm very verbose. I have a thus, therefore, heretofore problem because I used to do federal appellate litigation, and you use lots of words like that in appellate briefs. Um, so it was really an extension of that, of how do we take, an integral part of this book is the many court decisions that were handed down from both state and federal court. They're hundreds of pages long. I think I did the math at one point. There's over 1,000 pages of court decisions that came out of all of this. And how do we distill that into information that is going to A, educate people, and B, make them care about this? So I think that was, a place where our partnership was helpful because sometimes I would read things and be like, oh, this is obvious. Everyone knows this. And Josh would be like, wait a minute, like, no, it isn't. And, even just when we were talking about gerrymandering itself, one of the things that was really interesting to me is, like I said, I grew up in Massachusetts, and the town I grew up in was right outside of the original gerrymander. So I learned what gerrymandering was when I was in third grade because it's like part of New England colonial history. And it was really interesting to me once we got into this and I started talking to people in other parts of the country. And I was like, did you learn this in third grade? And without fail, everyone said no. And that was really shocking to me because I just thought that this was something that everybody knew. And finding out that it wasn't, I think it gave us further motivation to be like, okay, but we want to make sure that they know now.
And I would also just say, just combining the journalist and the lawyer, the writing styles, 100% different. So in TV, we're taught don't use 10 words when five will work. And in the legal world, she's taught don't use 10 words when 100 words will work. And so we went back and forth, and I was like, Rory, this is too much, or she would say this is not enough. And so, yeah, there was the tug of war there between the two different styles. And ultimately, what won out is what's behind me on the screen.
Was having a professional editor.
That too.
Well, I noticed that Cheryl said people have a better understanding of gerrymandering than they did, say, 10 years ago.
Mhm.
And I think part of that has to do with like the gerrymandering wars. So I'm interested in the kind of interviews that you did. So I know that you interviewed, basically a dozen folks, and I just wondered
Oh,
what
dozens,
Yeah.
dozens.
It,
dozens,
Oh
okay,
yeah.
dozens.
I think 42 interviews in all.
Wow. So this makes me think about, and people from across the political spectrum.
hmm
And did anybody, did any of those conversations surprise you? Are there things that you learned that you thought we might find helpful?
Yeah, look, here's what I would say. I would say more than any one interview, I was surprised at how much one side that you thought was going to say said almost the exact opposite. So, we talked to Republicans in this book that said, yes, of course, we're gerrymandering maps, that this failed. We had Democrats that said the same thing. We had justices and judges that we talked to that said the court limits weren't strong enough, that there should have been more. We had advocates that we spoke to that gave different answers for what is the best solution to this. And so overall, we walked away from this book saying, look, the most important thing we can do, the fact that we've talked to all these people, is to share everything that we've done. Because one thing that we're doing here isn't giving a bullet answer, like a bullet that just goes through everything, saying this is what's going to bring gerrymandering once and for all. And we'll obviously say it in the book, but if you're expecting to read this book for one simple answer, I mean, you're going to be disappointed. Because there isn't one answer. The answer, if you want one answer, is to stay politically involved every single bit of the year and not just every 4 years to tune in and tune out. But I think that's what I was most surprised about. If we give one interview in particular, I would say that stood out to me. It was probably our shortest interview that we had, and that was with then Lieutenant Governor John Husted, who is now the senator of Ohio. He was, if anybody knows him or listened to him, he doesn't really hide the truth, or at least hide how he's thinking, I should say. He is very quick to basically point out what he believes in and just say it. And I would think Rory, without getting, overly controversial here, he definitely shared his mind. He definitely said this is where things could have gone different, going back to, 2010. But then he also basically said that, Democrats had their chance to have the state one way, and his words were they basically blew it. And then this is what Republicans have done in response. Now, again, you don't have to agree with him. You don't have to disagree with him. But I was definitely surprised at just how forward he was about this. Take with that what you will.
Yeah, and I would just add, I I thought yes, Husted was very candid in a way that people who are currently in an elected office were reluctant to be.
Mhm.
Two of my other favorite interviews, likewise came from people who we disagreed with. Jeff Jacobson was very generous with his time. We sat down with him 4 separate times to go over this, and he is a true believer in those 2015 and 2018 amendments. And I just want to call that out because we went into this knowing that we had very different opinions of these things. And, I always say, like, one of my mantras that I try to live by is at any given point, I should be able to articulate what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And if I struggle with doing that, that's like an indication to me that maybe I'm doing something that like doesn't align with my values. I should think about it. And he was, like I said, he is a true believer and, was just willing to explain like in immense detail on multiple occasions, like, here's why we did this, here's why I think it's good, here are the problems. And a lot of people in that position are like, oh, you disagree with me, like I'm not going to bother. Again, we mentioned we got that from a lot of people, but somebody who really truly believes in what they're doing and is willing to defend it, I think that was an important perspective to include. So I appreciated that he spent as much time with us as he did, knowing full well that we disagreed with him on the substance. The other one I was going to say was just Bill Seitz, just because he's Bill Seitz and he says lots of entertaining and colorful things.
Yeah,
Well,
for sure.
and for folks who are like, wait a second, Jeff Jacobson.
Mhm.
So he's a former state rep and state senator. And during 2014, when we were in the midst of the reforms of state legislative districts, he worked very closely with Dick Gunther, and some of you will remember Professor Dick Gunther, to try to figure out, well, how can I put this? To negotiate and think about like what are the best policies. And the thing that I think is important to remember about that 2014 reforms for the state legislature, it included a metric. So as opposed to just saying, okay, we're going to ban gerrymandering or we're going to define it, just give a definition of, drawing district lines to favor or disfavor one political party or a candidate, or it included a metric, the representational fairness, which sometimes it gets called proportionality.
Yep.
And so I have to say, I have always enjoyed my chats with Jeff Jacobson. He is, focused on in many ways what's good for his political party, but also is somebody who cares a lot about the map making, and has very specific ideas about how you can make some changes. So that actually brings me to this there was a question in the chat that just had to do with like, well, how do you define, the number of Democratic maps or Republic, how many Democratic districts there should be or Republican districts? And, how do you actually define that? And was that part of the conversation in the book?
I think it was a big part of the conversation with the book because even just going back to the conversations we had with Jeff Jacobson, who, by the way, quote that's not in the book, but he said on the House floor, gerrymandering is the most fun you can have without going to jail. So, he's kind of known for statements like that. But his point was in all these conversations we had, with legislative council and things like that, that provision was, this whole aspirational, not mandatory. So those were a lot of the conversations we had with people is how do you read this language and what does it mean? And so you'll see that in the book that different people, there's a saying that where you stand often depends on where you sit. And so you see the different answers we get from people who are sitting in different positions, whether they're on the court or in elected office, whether they're Republicans, Democrats. And that's really like the $1 million question, because that is what so much of the litigation and the fights over these maps centered around. And so on the legal side of things, I think that that drives home another point that's not just about gerrymandering, but we've seen this increasing politicization of the courts on both the state and the federal level, really over the past 10 to 15 years. And that really comes into play when you are interpreting something like that, that people have genuine disagreements over. Rightly or wrongly, there were genuine disagreements about whether that language was mandatory or not. And just the fact that some of those arguments became so nakedly partisan, that was really disappointing to me. And we just saw something similar in Florida where their new maps were challenged. Florida had very similar language in their state constitution to Ohio. And we saw a similar outcome in Florida where a state court that was controlled by Republicans who those maps favored were like, well, does this count as unduly favoring a political party? Nah. And yeah. So, like Josh said earlier, the point of this book is to make you aware of what happened and to make you aware to the point that you're angry and that you're so angry that you want to do something about it. It's not to say, here's the right answer. So we share a lot of perspectives on that. We aren't trying to say here, it's not a black and white, this is good, this is bad. But here are all of these perspectives, and here's what people are saying. If this makes you mad, like, come join us in this fight.
Yeah, and Arnold Schwarzenegger summed it up perfectly. He said, "Get off your effing couch."
Yes.
So,
Oh dear. So we had another question that I thought, that was about when Frank LaRose essentially said the maps was asinine
mhm,
and then went and voted for it.
sure
So
did.
one, I want to do a shout out to public records because we would not have known that
Mhm,
without good public records.
absolutely.
Um, and then Josh, I don't know if you know this. Um, they have changed things so that we cannot get records related to the state legislature until after the General Assembly has concluded.
I'm sure that's what a gerrymandered supermajority decided.
Yes, it is.
Hmm.
And back to Frank LaRose and the asinine map.
Yeah, that's pointed out in the book. Of course it is. And he didn't really have a good explanation. You got to remember at the time, this was a guy who was the Secretary of State who was running for the United States Senate. I don't know if he had said he was exploring it at the very least, but he knew that going into an election year that he wanted to do that. And so he had a choice. And the choice was, do you stand up for the rule of law and for the people? Or do you stand with your party? And his text message, we don't have to sum it up. He summed it up. He said that these maps are asinine. But then you saw his chief of staff was like, well, if you go ahead and you say that or you vote against them, that's not going to be a great look for you. And so, Frank LaRose, the Boy Scout that he was, quite literally, fell in line and he voted with the maps. There were other explanations in different rounds that I can remember where, there were maps rolled out at the last minute that, Republicans on the commission hadn't seen. And they were like, oh, no, we're good with these. But then we had maps that, like, for instance, the independent map makers worked on, and that was in broad daylight, but we had problems with those. And so, yeah, I mean, this whole process just went off the rails. I mean, this was supposed to be a 3-week blip on the radar that was nothing to write home about. And all we were going to do is champion you guys for getting the process right. And we saw very clearly the bad actors that were at play. And it's a real shame. And this is why we feel like this is something that should be shared with the rest of the country, because even though we got a front row seat in Ohio, this is definitely happening everywhere on both sides of the aisle.
So I know for myself that one of the things that I found the saddest and the most irritating had to do with Governor DeWine. And, his acting like somehow map making was happening to him
Mhm.
rather than he was the governor of the state of Ohio. So it's hard for me to put this in question form, but I
Mhm.
just wondered, in as you were kind of exploring this with different people, what were their takes and what was your takeaway?
So, kind of combining your question about Governor DeWine and Frank LaRose's asinine comment, we have this in a chapter where we compare that basically the Republicans on the redistricting committee are like being in the plastics and Mean Girls. And there's this quote from the movie where they say it's better to be on the inside hating life than to be on the outside.
Yep.
And we use that analogy for Governor DeWine because he found out during COVID what happens when you cross Matt Huffman and the Republican supermajority. And they very quickly went after him and attacked him, and he decided he did not want to go through that again. So he was going to sit back and, be this passive character that, like you said, things apparently just happened to. And, that was disappointing. And, again, it ties back into what you were just talking about with Frank LaRose and his comments is that, like, you see, he has this initial urge to do the right thing, but staying on the inside ultimately became more important to him. So I feel like that's a good analogy to kind of describe this dynamic and why we saw the behavior that we did, from people involved like Governor DeWine and like Frank LaRose.
Yeah, and Governor DeWine knows that he has to work with the legislature who already slapped his hand down during COVID. And so he also was in an election year himself in 2022. And he knew that he wasn't going to cross them again because he saw what happened. And, there were times where he wasn't even involved. He went to a Cincinnati Bengals practice one time because he felt that that was more important than showing up for an Ohio Redistricting Commission meeting. That was a true slap in the face to every Ohioan that wanted fair maps. And then basically said, yeah, it was on the schedule. So like we went, it wasn't a big deal what I missed. Like, okay, there's real people's lives that hang in the balance with these maps. And that's the other thing. Like, yes. Or do we talk about gerrymandering? Do we talk about maps? Absolutely. But it's not about the maps. It's about the people that are caught in the middle of this and the real life implications that happen as a result of maps that are unfairly drawn. And so, yeah, Governor DeWine was probably the biggest disappointment of everybody on the commission because you could have seen it coming with Matt Huffman. You could have seen it coming with Robert Cupp. Keith Faber had his own reasons for why he felt things were gerrymandered to favor Democrats, which was a whole other scenario. You had the Democrats on the commission. First it was the two Sykeses, and then it was Allison Russo, and then eventually Isaac Min. But it was a or Nikki Antonio, I should say. You know, it was truly the statewide leaders that were the most that could have been swayed, right? Because they're not the ones that are directly impacted by the maps. And all it took was two of them if they would have come to play, and they didn't. There was that hint in the beginning where maybe, LaRose and Faber are talking to the Sykeses. Maybe we get this bipartisan compromise. I remember that day. And then all of a sudden, very quickly, Catherine, that's when we saw the musical chairs going back and forth in the rooms. And it was like, wow, how many laws are they breaking here with the sunshine laws? And, yeah, they were never held to account. And, yeah, unfortunately, they ended up winning re-election and everything was for naught.
I think these things can be really painful when we go back and look at what happened. One of the things that I find the most challenging had to do with what ended up feeling like a merry-go-round with the Ohio Supreme Court. And some of us went to the, Justice in Motion. So basically this is a tour of former justices and judges and attorney generals. And they're in Ohio now. They started in Pennsylvania. They were in Columbus today. They're going to be in Cleveland tomorrow. And Maureen O'Connor called out, like, why should you care about kind of judicial elections? And she talked about gerrymandering, and the importance of having good people on the court. And it really hit me again, just how it's not just the map making, it's all about the interpretation as well. Could you tell us a little bit about, interviews about that, or what it was like to think about not just the actual map making, but how it played out as we, 5 times for state legislative maps, twice for congressional, that they were declared to be unconstitutional, and that our hopes were just dashed repeatedly.
So, big picture, I just want to say about that because you're talking about justice in motion. I think one of the points that we try to make is, none of these things exist in a vacuum. Representation is really important and it's something that people should care about. And even if they think, oh, why, this doesn't affect me, it's pointing out that it does. So people maybe aren't thinking about who they're going to vote for on the state Supreme Court. But it matters because these are the people that are making the interpretation of these maps, as well as, many other things. But, when people think about government, they tend to focus on what's happening in Washington. And we try to make the point that so much of the things that impact your daily life take place at the State House. So things about roads, schools, utilities, all of those are things that take place on the local level. So this is something that we try to connect these dots for people. You might think, oh, well, I'm not litigious. I don't care who's on the state Supreme Court. But they're going to decide these issues that affect so many things about your life. And so none of these things are, again, so many people are looking for this quick fix and this silver bullet. And that's not the way that democracy works. A lot of these reforms work in tandem. And so even, back to the point, if there might be people who are like, well, I don't care about gerrymandering. I don't think it's an issue in my state. Well, it is because whether it's your state house or Congress, it impacts the overall balance of representation in this country. It affects literally every single person that lives here. And one of the points that we bring up in the book is it even impacts people who are not old enough to vote yet. It has impacts on the lives of children. I mean, I'm a mom. This is something I think about all the time is, what kind of country is my son going to inherit? And that's, a huge motivator for me and why I care about these issues and why I do what I do. So, my point with all of that is we do have sections in the book where we kind of unpack here's how electing judges work, here's what's going on in the federal level, here's how this stuff is interrelated. And so I hope that that resonates with some people. As these decisions were getting handed down, and then we saw the transition of the Supreme Court, I think you had a pretty clear example of our court is politicized because the facts of the case didn't change, only the makeup of the court did. And then all of a sudden it was a different decision. And we talk about forum shopping as well, when they were getting frustrated by the decisions that were initially coming out of the state Supreme Court when Maureen O'Connor was a Supreme was the
Just
Chief
Chief
Justice.
Justice. Yeah.
Yeah. Then they're like, well, we're going to try our hand in federal court. We think we're going to get a different outcome. And that's exactly what happened. So again, a lot of the interviews that we did, we didn't want to get too bogged down in the language of the decisions themselves because particularly over time, a lot of it is redundant. But just to take some of the snippets for people and try to, again, connect those dots of here's why you should care about this.
And I'll just say, just not Roy summed that up perfectly. I'll just give a little tease to the book here in mentioning Maureen O'Connor. Truly the judicial rock star of this whole book and this whole process. Be on the lookout for who we compare her to in the book. It's a very fun reference. Again, won't give it away, but you got to read it to find out.
She was also very generous with her time.
She
And,
was.
our timing of this book was good because once she had retired, she was able to speak more freely about the events that had gone on, particularly in these specific decisions that we talked about. We did talk to one other state Supreme Court justice who was still on the bench and was therefore, fairly limited in what they could and couldn't say just because of judicial ethics issues. But we did really appreciate just again, you talk about people who are true believers, and Maureen O'Connor is a true believer in the fact that partisan gerrymandering is bad. And we really appreciated just how much time and how much of her perspective she shared on all of these individual decisions.
One of the questions that we have in the chat has to do with 2024. And Maureen O'Connor really led the charge to, basically create an independent citizens redistricting commission. Many of us collected signatures and advocated and encouraged folks to vote for, citizens, not politicians. That it was an amendment. That was not successful. And the question that is in the Q&A has to do with the terrible, egregious ballot language. And the question was that something that you covered?
Mhm.
And what was your takeaway from those conversations?
And look, and here's what I would say pretty bluntly here. I'm going to push back on you saying it wasn't successful because I think it was successful. I just think that voters ultimately were confused by the time that they went. And in fact, that's what we heard. We heard that there were people that went into, the ballot, into the voting booth, thinking they were voting to end gerrymandering because that's what the ballot language said, right? It said that this would be gerrymandering if you had to do this. And they were like, well, no, 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 no. We just got schooled by Catherine Terser and by Jen Miller and by everybody else that no, gerrymandering's bad. So we don't want that. So I would say that you guys made a difference. But ultimately, yeah, the ballot board is what did everybody in. And, that we have some colorful language from
I,
Jen in the book, ultimately about, you know, people and their knowledge of the ballot board and, just what the ballot board did and how corrupt it really was and how people don't really understand, that the ballot board's controlled by politicians. And that's the whole problem with all of this, right? I mean, we have to take the politicians out of this if we truly want an independent process. And I don't think a lot of people understood that. Obviously, again, the politically inclined did, but I don't think that the large swath of people truly understood. So I would say, as far as an optimistic point of view, I don't think that you guys were unsuccessful. I think that people were hoodwinked, and therefore I think that was the real problem. And it's absolutely something that we discuss.
it's
So,
incredibly hard to not look at that as successful when you think about just the sheer number of
oh,
signatures that had to be collected. And absolutely right.
Uh-oh.
We
Catherine's
should
getting a
be
little
we should
funny.
be looking at that.
Um, I just want to chime in on the ballot language thing because I think that ballot language is the next frontier of this fight. And, it was a little bit beyond the scope of this book because we were finishing up as it was unfolding in real time. But we saw this in Virginia. Virginia also had some challenging ballot language, and that got very politicized. And this is back to the point that we were making in the introduction. There were states who saw what happened in Ohio and were like, oh, we can just manipulate the ballot language and no one will say anything. Great. And you've seen other states do that. And so, again, this connects several of the things that are going on. Um, Not just the ballot board as politicians, but the language, if it's challenged, is going to your state Supreme Court, which has become politicized. So you see how all of these things interrelate. And I just think, you know, it was disappointing to see um, that the language said required to gerrymander. That's obviously, like we said, one of the biggest disappointments. But I think as we talk about how we continue this fight in the future, we've seen the state legislature is gerrymandered, it's unresponsive. So people are increasingly turning to ballot initiatives. Now they're learning how to manipulate ballot language too. So that's something I would encourage everybody to stay on top of, stay aware of, and continue to call out when things like that happen.
So is this a good time to do another excerpt from the
Sure.
book?
Yeah, absolutely. We started with the beginning there, and we'll give you a little bit of the epilogue here. Hopefully this fires you up a little bit because I told Rory I read this right before the meeting here, and I was like, man, I'm jacked up. So hopefully this does something for you. I'll read this part. It seems impossible to think Democrats and Republicans will stop fighting. And frankly, having more than one entity present an opposing viewpoint is crucial to the system of checks and balances we hold dear. But a truce does not need to be reached between the public and those who continue to prey on us. As Jen Miller put it, quote, it's the people versus corruption. Corruption can permanently live and thrive if we do not run interference over the long haul. Quote, it's not the American 30-minute sitcom where every problem and solution come easily, she reminded us. Democracy is largely shaped by culture at the state and federal levels. People come to Washington hoping it resembles the West Wing and fearing its house of cards. In reality, it's Veep. Messy, chaotic, and held together by overworked staffers and the hope that no one notices how fragile it all is. If we reframe the fight as fairness versus cheating, we can break out of our country's doom loop. The origin of our struggles is rooted in gerrymandering and voter suppression, but our culture wars stay in motion because the political class keeps the public distracted and divided against itself. We cannot fall for these smaller arguments while ignoring the bigger chasms. Miller and the League of Women Voters made a deliberate shift after the 2024 redistricting loss by leaning more into civic education. They pushed harder to provide people the information to better know how government works and how to grow democracy. The League doesn't endorse candidates or tell anyone how to vote, but they arm voters with the stuff the political class hopes they never learn. A lot of that starts on college campuses, where some of the youngest voters are still figuring out what even appears on a ballot. In discussing her shift in focus, Miller shared, quote, they don't even know what the ballot board is. They don't know that what you see on your ballot is not what the amendment is. They don't realize that the ballot board is full of politicians, end quote. And she's right. Most people have no idea who writes ballot language or how easily it can be warped before they ever lay eyes on it. The League's strategy is simple. They want voters to treat elections the same way they treat hiring a candidate for an important job. Miller explained, quote, first, we need to understand their job description. If you understand their job description, then you can decide who's more qualified or more trustworthy to hold that job. And then once they get in office, you can hold them accountable. The League might be primarily focused on students, but this strategy could work for all of us. The part people forget is democracy doesn't break all at once, but erodes when people stop showing up. What doesn't work is checking in every 4 years and tuning out again. We have to vote in the elections no one is talking about, the ones that happen quietly and constantly between presidential cycles. Consistently attend the events where real power lives, such as school board meetings, city councils, town halls, and state-level committee hearings. You don't need to be a redistricting expert to make your voice heard at a hearing or in conversation with a peer. Start by saying the simple truth. Voters should choose their elected officials, not the other way around. Learn your district's map and ask people why it looks the way it does. You can email your representatives, testify on state and federal bills, and rely on local news since those reporters feel the consequences of policy directly in your community. Politicians respond to pressure faster when they know the public is actually paying attention. Miller says the goal is to create, quote, a stabilizing force for democracy voters, end quote, at the local level. And she's realistic about what that requires. It's not about redistricting alone. We need a pro-volunteer base, especially if gerrymandering continues. Around the country, there are states where one party controls every lever of government and the guardrails have disappeared. And part of building that pro voter base is being real about who we are up against and what they gain when we stay silent. Let's start with the people holding the pencils, pens, and computer mice who draw the lines and intentionally suppress certain voters' rights. The map makers have shown us exactly how they view the public they are supposed to serve. There must be laws to hold their feet to the fire. Lawmakers and candidates may be saying one thing to you, but those messages are often crafted far from the communities they represent. There are consultants who focus group the focus groups themselves to fine tune messaging. They talk about districts like real estate portfolios instead of places with real people and problems that need solving. Consultants and politicians need to be held accountable for the distortions they amplify. The First Amendment may shield what they say, but your memory and your vote are far more powerful than they expect. We have the power, and realizing that is the first step to a better tomorrow. The second step doesn't require perfection, just bold ideas and the will to pursue them. Some are already on the table, laid out for us by a trio of professors and an Ohio Supreme Court justice. Christian Gross, political science professor and director of the University of Southern California Schwarzenegger Institute, argues for pushing independent redistricting in pairs, one red and one blue state together. University of Kentucky law professor Joshua Douglas believes state courts can and should presume mid-decade maps are unconstitutional. Ned Foley, professor, chair in constitutional law, and director of election at Ohio State Moritz College of Law, proposes self-districting, letting voters decide how they want to be grouped. And Justice Jennifer Brunner suggests making independent redistricting commissions operate like jury duty, where everyday citizens are drafted for the task to minimize political influence and maximize a sense of civic duty. These ideas may sound radical, but at one time, so did one person, one vote. The blueprint also comes from the people who live this fight every day. Arnold Schwarzenegger told Ohioans in colorful language that you can't change the world from your couch. Catherine Terser showed the value of vigilance and following the money, even when people would rather look away. Vernon Sykes proved that persistence matters even when leadership refuses to change. And Miller, the Rocky-like figure of Ohio democracy, demonstrated that you can take the hits, get back up, and keep moving forward because that's what living is. Together, they are like the Avengers, who fight tougher than most because giving up is not an option. But the deeper lesson is action matters more than permission. You don't need approval to get in the ring. This story was never just about Ohio, but a case study in how power is created and corrupted and how ordinary people respond as it metastasizes. Ohio may have shown us one version of the battlefield, but every state rushes hearings, pulls last-minute legal maneuvers, and crafts confusing ballot language. It's not that Ohio is the only problematic state. It's that the Buckeye State demonstrates how quickly the race to the bottom can spread. Somewhere in Ohio, a young girl crossed the state line she never should have had to. The adults who were supposed to protect her had spent more time defending their seats. When she grows up, she won't remember the lawmakers, the candidates, or the lawsuits that followed, but she may never shake the feeling of being treated like a pawn, moved around to serve someone else's state self-interest. We owe her a system worthy of her future, not just the outrage. Now is the time to draw our own lines. If we don't, then they will continue to be drawn for us by those more interested in our apathy and disgust. Democracy doesn't move in a straight line, but it bends towards the people who keep pushing even a little and even when they're tired.
Wow, I feel incredibly, incredibly inspired. So, in this case, I'm not going to ask you a question. I just wonder if you had any final words or things that you were like, oh, I wish I'd said this.
Rory?
Yeah, so a final thing I would say is, at the beginning of this conversation, I had referenced, this book that I wrote about the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims. And that is, it reviews veterans' benefits decisions. For 200 years, veterans didn't have the right to judicial review. So creating this court, it seems like a no-brainer. Like, veterans serve our country. Of course, they should have the right to judicial review. Criminals have the right to judicial review. Immigrants have the right to judicial review. Literally, everybody has the right to judicial review. But it took 40 years to accomplish what seems like it should have been a very straightforward initiative that people can get behind. And I share that because things often take much longer. And in the age of instant everything and Instagram and Instacart, people want fast solutions. And that's just not how it works. And so it's going to take longer than I think people want. And I think that it's going to be, the fight is going to continue. It's not over because of these mid-decade gerrymandering wars. And, because it's going to take so long, I just want to take a minute to encourage people to kind of think outside the box, like this was saying. We have some of those ideas by professors, but there are other ones, and I just would encourage people to look at those. Our friends at the Brennan Center just came out with a report of 8 ways to reform Congress. Some really good ideas in there about term limits, age limits, uncapping the House, all of these things that I think people should be thinking about. And so I would just encourage people, if you care about ending gerrymandering, continue to look at the big picture, courts, ballot language, all of these things, because the fight ain't over. And it's probably going to go on for much longer than we want it to.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing I'll clear up here, obviously, because we picked excerpts of the book. When we at the end of my passage here that I read, that girl that I talked about was the 10-year-old girl that ultimately was sexually assaulted and had to go to Indiana to have an abortion. And we'll talk about her at the beginning of our book. Um, you know, Similar to what Rory said, one thing that we have in there, and it's less about what we didn't talk about, but more so what we did. And one of the things that we pointed out is one of the most offensive things you can say to someone is, "I'm not that into politics." We say because politics is into you. And if you don't have a seat at the table, then chances are you're on the menu, right? I'm not the first one to say that. I'm just the last one to say that. And if you're ever talking to somebody about this, it's very easy to have the Democrat versus Republican fight. As soon as you do, people tune out. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. It's my party, and my party's better than your party, regardless of what they're doing. And that's why we have to change this conversation. We have to change it with the boots on the ground. We have to change this conversation with how journalists talk about this. I've talked to many journalist friends of mine who always come at me and they say, well, this many seats and that many seats for this state and that state. And I say, why don't you change the scoreboard that you're talking about? Because it's not that this is a 24-4 map in Florida or this is a 10-5 map in Ohio. How about the millions of people that are going to have their rights suppressed? Why don't we keep that scoreboard? Why don't you, when you talk about Florida, why don't you say it's 10 million people that are going to have their rights suppressed? And maybe you'll actually have people buy in. And when you don't say it's just about maps and it's just about this, politics live in your gas bill, your grocery bill, your housing, your healthcare, your education, everywhere. And so that's ultimately the point that we need to get across. This might have started about maps and it might continue about maps. No, it absolutely will continue about maps because after this election, more states are going to gerrymander. But you just need to talk to people on a very basic level, meet them where they're at and say, look, you need to care about this because if you're interested in solving women's rights or guns or education or whatever, it starts here. And if you don't fix this, you will never, ever fix the other issues that you care about.
Well, I just wanted to extend a great big thank you. We really needed some inspiration, and you definitely provided it. Once again, the book will be
Sorry, her
put in
internet.
an order.
we go.
I'll help you out here, Catherine. So
Thank you.
it is being pre-ordered right now. Pre-orders are available, I should say, either on Amazon or on simon&schuster.com. You can certainly look it up there. The book does come out September 30th. I can tell you that Rory and I right now are planning different events for around the country. And we certainly are looking to come to Ohio, so stay tuned for that. Catherine and I will certainly talk more. We'll talk more with all the advocates to see where's the best place for us to go. But we're really passionate about this, and we're so excited, and we just really want to thank Fair Districts for having us on.
Yeah, thank you.
So our next huddle is going to be in September. So we are taking August off. And I do want to encourage you, if there's something special that you'd like to cover during that huddle, please send me an email. We'll send you a follow-up with the slides and the recording. But I also wanted to let you know that, there are upcoming events. So the Ohio Voter Rights Coalition call is coming up very soon. We also have Coffee with Common Cause, and which is really fun. Ooh, there's a Good Trouble one, which focuses on how can we protect our vote. So this is part of the Good Trouble Lives On weekend. So I highly encourage you all to do that. The other thing is we have a couple fair courts webinars that are coming up. The judges and judicial philosophy in the environment, and one that focuses on the PUCO and state agencies and the courts. And then there's the Election Protection Summit. So we have all things voting going on, and you'll notice there is an error there.
Yeah.
It should be Friday, July 10th.
Yeah.
So in case you were like, wait a second, there's something not quite right. But no matter what, we'll send you a follow-up with all of the information so you can RSVP. And we look forward to seeing you at the next event and at the Huddle, which is going to be in September. If you have something you want to do, like I, for one, want to do one on campaign finance. We just got a decision from the Supreme Court. So if that sounds good to you, let me know. If you have other ideas, send a note, please. cturser@commoncause.org. And with that, we would like to just say thank you for sharing. Thank you for spending time with us. And we really appreciate the inspiration. And with that, I'm going to say, everyone, thank you so much, and we'll bid you adieu.
Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everybody.